This is Transported from Tel Aviv around the world. This is going to be a multi-part episode again. The objective here is to try and articulate a few things. One is what has been going on in the world of Hasbara, which is incorrectly translated as propaganda, sometimes even by some of the gormless twits who get put out to speak to the international media on behalf of the Israeli government. Hasbara means explaining. It goes a lot further. Public advocacy is probably the way we would translate it these days. It's always been the case that Israel doesn't just get to point at obvious facts. We have to explain. We're made to explain. We're held to double and triple standards. We know this to be the case. It's deeply frustrating. But I've often said that actually it is our job to rise above that, go beyond even the ridiculous measures that they set us. We have facts and good on our side, largely. And even where we don't, we are at least willing to discuss the darker parts of our history, because that's important. We have to understand where we came from, and we have to be honest that nothing is ever peaches and cream. So in each part of this episode, I'm going to try and tackle some different angles of the way I think we should be talking about Israel, looking at the strategy of the government and NGOs around the world, and trying to get to grips a little bit, because I think this is something people are getting very frustrated. We're 19 months into this war, and people are exhausted. They need something to boost them. So in this first one, I'm going to go with a very light touch on the content. So all I'm going to do is read out a correspondence that I had on the Facebook page of an acquaintance. I'll set the scene. The acquaintance is someone who comes from typical old school left. I don't think he's someone who feels entirely comfortable with Jews, at least as he perceives them. He's never said as much, but there's the interesting quirk that pretty much the only political topic that he has ever commented on his Facebook page, and he is a very avid poster, is of course this. There's been one or two bits of Ukraine over the years, but it is wall-to-wall Palestine for the last 19 months on his Facebook page. He's very careful not to even say what he thinks, apart from maybe one or two lines of introduction that imply it quite strongly, and then he just reposts whatever he's seen. So I'm always very wary of engaging with such people and their friends, because usually you're just shouting into the void. They've made up their minds. But I know this guy's not a dick. He's just coming from a certain background, heavily involved in the music industry in the 70s, kind of a stereotypical view you would think of what he's going to believe in. He posted the other day something that's been doing the rounds for many years. Brian Eno, the musician, composed the little Microsoft jingle that you hear when your computer loads up. And then he got very angry that Microsoft was working in ways that he didn't approve of with the IDF and other military forces, and he basically said, I can't take back the fact that you have my music, but I abhor the fact that it is being used by ethnic cleansing, occupying forces, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm donating the money I get from my royalties to the beloved Palestinians. So this chap reposted the Brian Eno letter. And of course, people underneath came out with the usual comments of, oh my gosh, that's terrible, isn't it? Oh yes, good for Brian Eno, good for you for saying it, etc., etc. So I thought, you know what, I'm not going to just have this. So I wrote underneath, and yet when it comes to the best way to permanently end the war by releasing the hostages and disarming Hamas, it's just the frozen blue screen. Within a few minutes, I got a reply from someone we'll just call JP. Michael Friedman, it's not a war, that's the spin. It's ethnic cleansing and colonization. Hamas is a resistance movement fighting an occupying force, trying to stop them wiping out their people and taking over their land. Israel is the problem, not the people resisting them. So I clicked on JP's profile. I was curious to see who he was. Very similarly, not a whole lot to say about any other subject, but this is the thing that seems to get to him, so on this he's apparently now an expert. I wrote back, JP, so everything that happened on October the 7th, which took place in Israel proper, was resisting the occupation of Gaza? JP writes back, Israel proper, inverted commas, is a misnomer, as so much of the land that Israel has had been stolen through force. Palestinians have been squeezed into ever-shrinking patches of their homeland. October the 7th was an uprising against the murderous occupying force that's been stealing land and killing the population for decades. I don't support the approach by Hamas, but to portray them as the reason for the current genocide is false. Their attack has been used cynically as justification for further and much more extreme expansion and ethnic cleansing. And let's not forget that, as had been admitted by Israeli officials and reported in Haaretz, the Israeli army itself killed hundreds of its own people on October the 7th using its Hannibal directive. That fact gets suspiciously little airtime. So now I was particularly curious to see what else he was going to try and cough up from the usual dungeons of canard that get thrown against us. JP, would you provide a link to these statements about the Hannibal Directive, please? Glad to hear that at least you don't support the approach of Hamas to murdering Vivian Silva, a lifelong peace activist living on a left-wing kibbutz. JP then posts up a Haaretz article behind a paywall, and something from some random Indian channel about Yoav Gallant. The titles of these articles: IDF ordered Hannibal Directive on October the 7th to prevent Hamas taking soldiers captive, and ex-Israel army chief admits using Hannibal Directive against own soldiers. So I read the second article and I got behind the paywall of the first one, and lo and behold, I write back, JP, I think the headlines of these articles are a bit misleading. Have you read beyond the paywalled excerpt of the first one and seen the full original interview with Gallant? He writes back, the headlines are fairly straightforward, aren't they? I haven't got access to Haaretz fully. There's a summary here, though. And he posts from Al Jazeera, regurgitating parts of that report. Israeli army used Hannibal Directive during October the 7th Hamas attack. JP, I read the original article at the time and watched the full Gallant interview. It's clear from both, and even from your Al Jazeera article, that IDF Central Command never authorized such a directive, partly because it was never a formal part of IDF doctrine, and such aspects that could be conceived as such were removed under, I think, Gabi Ashkenazi in 2016 and replaced with a much more nuanced set of orders, but that some local commanders took it upon themselves to implement a version of it. It's pretty clear from the investigations so far and from articles from sources unfriendly to the IDF and Israeli government, like Haaretz and Al Jazeera, that it was implemented ad hoc in the field on a very limited basis, as borne out by the results also mentioned in the same articles. Yet it has become a bizarrely well-known talking point among critics of Israel. At this point, other people, I think, began to see that the guy was going to flounder, so they started dropping their own comments in. One of the choicest ones was from AK. The small group of hostages were just an unfortunate but convenient red herring to justify a pre-planned mass racist slaughter. So I wrote back to him, please expand on your theory a little bit. Let's start with 710 itself. Was the whole thing a false flag or crisis actors, right down to fake Hamas GoPros? Or was there some kind of stand-down order? But do you at least think Hamas carried out the attack, or something else? He never wrote back. Back to good old JP. Michael, can you please offer your thoughts on the history of Israel taking over the land of Palestinians, demolishing villages and livelihoods such as farms, continued annexation, apartheid rule, and the now clearly stated aim of the Israeli government that they intend to take over all of Gaza? 710 is a very rare case of Palestine attacking its occupier, whereas the converse is going on for decades and continues. I really struggle to see how Israel can be defended when it is so clearly a country built on aggressive colonizing of an indigenous people. I also wonder whether you regard Palestinian lives as of less value than Israelis. Asked how many words I was allowed to use. He said 100 would be enough. So I wrote back, JP, I'll do the Jewish thing and answer your question with questions then. When you say taking over the land of Palestinians, etc., are we talking West Bank or inside Israel proper? Do you consider things like the Hebron massacre of 1929, PLO terrorism of the 70s and 80s, the suicide bombings of the 90s and the Second Intifada as rare cases? Do you think that Jews, as in people originating from Judea, are not also indigenous to the area? Hand on heart, do you really consider your wife's or child's or dad's life to be of the same value to you as the life of someone else, whether in London or Gaza or Tel Aviv? How do you act to demonstrate that equality of belief, if so? He writes back, whenever I've debated this issue with Zionists, evasion is the only response I get. It really is time that Israel and its supporters started a period of deep reflection and atonement. I wrote back, that's an obnoxious response, and I could equally point out that whenever I've debated this issue with so-called anti-Zionists, bombarding with endless new open points is the usual response I get. You asked leading questions and asked me to respond in 100 words. I don't owe you an essay, and you are not some Spanish monarch who can demand that I humour your disputation. He writes back, I despise the fact that, inverted commas, my country has been supporting Israel's aggression. I despise the way British treated the Irish and numerous other peoples over its history because I do not agree with the idea of colonialism by force. My confusion with people like you is that you defend your country unconditionally, despite its crimes being so blatant and vile. Can you not recognize that Israel has not treated Palestinians well for a very long time? I wrote back, you don't know me, but you seem happy to jump to conclusions about my views. You've even structured it as a "have you stopped beating your wife yet" statement. JP says, okay, sorry if I offended you. It wasn't my intention. I just get quite passionate about this issue. I've been watching videos of mutilated children and civilians for a year and a half, and I find it deeply sickening, particularly given the immense imbalance in resources between the Israeli army and Palestine. The recent choice to blockade and starve the population also upsets me, to say the least. I responded, JP, I don't give a crap about being offended. I care about whether I'm wasting my time investing in an online discussion with a stranger who has an immovable position. You actually asked me to do penance. It's so peculiarly quasi-religious to hold such strong and certain beliefs about peoples and conflicts 2,000 miles away that you think this is a reasonable way to go about discussing it with someone who actually has skin in the game. I sat in my Tel Aviv bomb shelter on October the 7th and made a plan for what to do if the gunman made it to the city. JP writes back, okay, I've been told. You're now drifting into ad hominem attacks, so let's just deal with the issues. I offered an apology and you're now insulting my viewpoint. Could you please tell me if you are willing to see that Israel is at least not wholly righteous in its conflict with Palestine? I wrote back, you said it really is time that Israel and its supporters started a period of deep reflection and atonement. That to me has quasi-religious tones. If you find it insulting and ad hominem to say so, we will get nowhere. Thicker skin is required for this subject. Should I demand and expect a period of deep reflection and atonement from pro-Palestinians for the actions of Hamas? I certainly haven't seen one yet, other than a handful of outliers like Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib, who has come out very clearly on this. He, just like me, has no love lost for Bibi and his handling of the situation, but is capable of clearly apportioning blame between the various sides. There are more than two. Of course, Israel is not wholly righteous. No nation is. Decent historians like Benny Morris are willing to tackle the darker parts of Israel's history because they matter to understanding who we are and how we got here. I find it a bit strange that you need to ask this question. If you spend any time with Israelis or reading the Israeli press, you will find a plethora of opinions and the most infinitesimal minority that thinks Israel has a flawless past. The problem is that in the midst of a conflict with a massive communications and public opinion component, there is not much room for nuance. We concede an inch on anything, they take a mile. Take, for example, where we started, the Hannibal Directive. I have the advantage of speaking Hebrew, so I can watch Gallant's full answer as he gave it, as well as the full original Haaretz piece. I can see how easily bad actors have extrapolated what was said and done into a deeply sinister accusation about Israeli callousness against its own people and an attempt to switch the blame for hundreds of deaths on October the 7th to Israel from Hamas. It being Israel, a small place, the much lesser story, has also been corroborated directly to me by people I know personally who are actually there. I would be interested to know if any of this moves your view at all about the existence, nature, and scale of the Hannibal Directive. It would give a clearer idea about whether I actually do owe you an apology for perceiving your views to be totally rigid. He writes back, I stand by the comments on the nation of Israel needing to reflect deeply. It has been treating another group of people from whom it has stolen land, lives, and houses as inferior and having lesser rights for decades. It is slaughtering them in the tens of thousands. I am willing to be moved in my opinion on the Hannibal Directive. From the reading around I've done, it's not conclusive how many people were killed because of this, but it does seem it was used. In truth, I'm not sure hundreds were killed by it, as I said earlier. However, the reason I am cautious about trusting Israeli sources about October the 7th is because of the discredited stories about beheaded babies and mass rapes, which were used to justify the following aggression by Israel. I reply, JP, thanks for the considered reply. Regarding the mass rapes, that rather grimly has not been discredited at all. You should watch Sheryl Sandberg's film on the subject, which is very carefully researched so as not to be hyperbolic. You can see it here at www.screamsbeforesilence.com. On the issue of the beheaded babies and some of the other possible rape occurrences that turned out to be false, it does seem like a lot of social media types and government spokespeople jumped on what were no more than rumors that circulated from some of the first responders, especially some of the Zaka staff who have the grim job of collecting body parts from such scenes. It absolutely did not do any favours to the credibility of anyone concerned, but it's also worth looking at the kind of situation these people were working under. The beheading story seems to have come from one Zaka volunteer who remains adamant about what he saw even now after Zaka and the IDF failed to corroborate his story and asked him to stop repeating it. His co-workers believe he is and was suffering from some form of PTSD from what he saw. Similarly, one of the most repeated stories from one of the Zaka workers was debunked by the IDF themselves. He misinterpreted a girl's lowered trousers as having been pulled down by terrorists, but in fact the IDF had moved her body to check for booby traps and her trousers had slipped. Zaka and other volunteers were trawling kibbutzim, grenaded bus shelters, destroyed cars and the music festival for body parts for weeks, at a scale totally unprecedented in Israel's history, in total chaos. Internal investigations determined, for example, that Zaka and the IDF each left it to each other to do forensic examinations, plus the religious imperative to identify and bury bodies as soon as possible, and all whilst it wasn't always 100% certain that every Hamas terrorist had been cleaned out of the area. I hope that provides a bit more context to where these claims came from. It doesn't excuse people making things up, but I don't ascribe malice to the Zaka workers who saw enough genuinely awful things without needing to exaggerate. Who knows what tricks the mind plays in these circumstances? The rumours certainly needed to be nipped in the bud earlier by responsible Israeli media and government spokespeople. That was a few days ago, and there the correspondence ceased. He obviously decided he really didn't want his views challenged any further. Similarly, the guy whose wall this all took place on, in the middle of all of this, had written to me to ask what I thought of an essay by Jonathan Layton, which you can look up on Medium. It's called "The Red Lines Far Behind Us, An Appeal to My Tribe." You can guess what it's going to say pretty much. As it happens, I'd already read it, so I wrote back to my acquaintance. I had just finished reading it actually. I started writing a reply and it was becoming an essay too. I do a small podcast of my thoughts each week and had some very similar misgivings, albeit reaching different conclusions in my last episode. I'm always happy to host a debate with people who disagree with me, if you or JP or Jonathan Layton want. That got no reply, and the next day my acquaintance was back at it, this time posting some crap from Jonathan Cook, who is an absolute foaming at the mouth hater of Israel on a good day. The gist of what Cook says in his article is that Israel is a wolf devouring the poor Palestinians, which of course was quite interesting, seeing as my last podcast episode was about how Israel is a fox and not the wolf. So I wrote my friend as follows. I invited you to listen to my podcast episode where I characterized Israel as a fox whilst its detractors see it as a wolf. Here we have Jonathan Cook, a writer you admire greatly, doing the latter. I don't think he's done a good job. With stocks of food completely exhausted by Israel's blockade, UN humanitarian chief Tom Fletcher told the BBC on Tuesday that some 14,000 babies could die in Gaza within 48 hours without immediate aid reaching them. That's a quote from the Cook article. See, this is the problem with writers like Cook, I wrote. Publications like Middle East Eye, and people who flippantly repost these things. Your friend and I have just been having a civilized discussion elsewhere on your wall about certain claims that were exaggerated or downplayed by each side, and the damage this does to trying to understand the truth. Fletcher had in fact misquoted the data and was referring to the total number of babies in Gaza that could be affected by food shortages over the coming year. Such retractions as there were appear in footnotes long after the fact. I can almost guarantee that someone will be along shortly to say, well, what about the babies that died already? Or, isn't 14,000 at risk over the year bad enough? When it's quite obvious that the point of knowingly using such hyperbole, both the UN and all the gleeful reposters, is to exert pressure on Israel to return to allowing Hamas to control the food supply in Gaza, thus perpetuating the conflict and/or Hamas rule. There are many more examples of simply poor or downright disingenuous reporting in this one article. One other is the business of the aid trucks. Even according to the UN, Israel has assembled 9,000 trucks worth of supplies at the border, pending finishing the setup of the new protocol for aid delivery that keeps it out of Hamas control. It's patently obvious that there is no intent to starve an entire population. The tactic of withholding aid may be unpalatable, and the optics are terrible, but the IDF has a very good idea of exactly what food supplies there are in Gaza, and have calculated to force Hamas to release what there is to the people or face an uprising, before resupplying in a way that doesn't fall into the same trap again. They had done so for over a year precisely because of Western do-gooders demanding that they victual their enemy or face the consequences, whilst failing to oblige Egypt, who could have fed, clothed and sheltered every civilian from October the 8th onwards in the vast empty expanse of the Sinai, to lift a finger. Of course, if they had, Cook et al. Would have screamed about it being a ruse to drive the population out of Gaza. Hats off to him and his ilk for the Zugzwang, at the expense of the very people they all claim to be trying to save. It's almost like that's not really what's motivating them. You're all welcome to boo and hiss from the sidelines and accuse Israel of whatever heinous crimes you like, but the majority of Israelis want to see the war over with the hostages home and Hamas gone, and have no interest in supporting or participating in any such crimes. However, they have come to the grim understanding that achieving these objectives involves some dreadful trade-offs where there are simply no right answers, and they don't care to listen to people who have no better ideas other than to blame them for existing in the first place. People who, thank goodness for your sakes, haven't had to face any of these dilemmas. Needless to say, I got no response from him, nothing from any of his friends, just one little angry face emoji at the bottom. That was it. Now, why have I bothered to read you all of this correspondence? I think that almost every argument that needs to be made on our behalf has been made trying to respond to these ghouls. And also that it's clear from the motivation of my acquaintance and from JP that actually they're not bad people. I think they would be genuinely horrified at the idea that they might be anti-Semites, perhaps on a subconscious level. But as we keep on trying to say, when you hold the one Jewish state to a totally different standard and take a ludicrously disproportionate interest in it above everybody else, it might be because you have some kind of problem with the Jews. Especially the wrong kind of Jew. The kind of Jew that they're not friends with. They're friends with classic, uninvolved Jewish liberals like this writer Jonathan Layton. Previously, this same acquaintance posted up this ghastly video by another part-time Jew called Daniel Pinchbeck. You can look him up. Honestly, even just watching him and listening to him speak made me into an anti-Semite. The guy's like a stereotypical caricature from Nazi Germany of what a Jew is supposed to be. What this also shows us is that once you indoctrinate people over not just 19 months of, as one of them puts it, all of the dead and mutilated bodies, but over years and years and years, that Israel is a colonial power and that the only way you can judge things is in this victim complex dynamic, which we've discussed before. And when we do such a terrible job of telling our own story, and we allow morons in the cabinet or in the Knesset as a whole to say and do things in public which have nothing to do with the policy we are implementing or any policy that will be a part of any Israeli government in the future, this is the kind of mess that we find ourselves in, where good people get so het up that they don't even notice where they cross lines into hectoring Jews. And even though I happen to think that this JP probably is fairly well-meaning, you can see from his responses that he falls into all of the normal traps. He didn't like my response to something, he threw 5 more accusations at me and then got upset when I didn't immediately refute every single one of them. He then projected onto me the exact thing that, in fact, he had just done to me. It's obvious from what I read to you, and I've cut and pasted this so that I have made no mistakes. He makes a series of ad hominem attacks on me and a series of general canards about us, and the moment that I point out that his language is really peculiar, he gets extremely upset at me and says that I am doing the ad hominem stuff. Now, quite often this is the last redoubt of a rogue like Mehdi Hassan or Dave Smith. But here you can see the chinks in the armor because you can see JP saying, actually, I'm just kind of overwrought by what I'm seeing. It's all so distressing. That's because these days people don't see the realities of war. The Ukrainians do a pretty good job of trying to keep their war on our TV screens. But it is, mercifully, largely a conflict between 2 standing armies. The Russians, of course, have carried out atrocities and continue to launch rockets that clearly aren't particularly well guided towards what you would call legitimate targets. But none of it is on the scale of reporting that we see. And of course, the difference is that the Ukrainians, by and large, are not looking for more Ukrainian martyrs. That's the difference between them and Hamas. What you can also see from these correspondences is that they really think that they are extremely educated on this subject because they've absorbed whatever skin-deep information they've been given alongside an emotional trigger that locks in that information as being certainty and fact. and allows them to extrapolate who the other might be and how terrible they are. And of course, everyone loves feeling righteous. That's what this is about for a lot of these people. They need a righteous cause. It's amazing how some of the least righteous people in the world have managed to harness all of these absolutely gullible people in this way. It takes years to try and retune that kind of brain. Years and years. And one of the problems that we have is that that is something the West is going to have to do across a whole variety of issues. We cannot have this continued victim-oppressor narrative through which every subject is considered. We're just seeing at the sharp end, because it's our reality day to day, what happens when that's applied to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But make no mistake, all of those same projections are being used when discussing migration policy or tax policy or even reproductive rights. It goes on, the way in which that prism is used. And I don't need to regurgitate the writings of many people, Rob Henderson's luxury beliefs, or Douglas Murray's idea that this is the front line in a war between democracies and death cults. You can see the effort that I had to go to try and just nudge him a little bit on one particular topic, and also that he did actually concede publicly that yes, he was prepared to move his opinion on that. But then he ran away before we could try anything else in his endless litany of allegations, none of which would stand up to scrutiny if he gave me a chance to show that I have scrutinized them, and that I'm not simply regurgitating some line from the Israeli government. I wish they paid me. I'm still not a Mossad spy. I hate to disappoint you, Mum. But these kind of correspondences actually make me hopeful. The fact is that I managed to argue the case well enough that nobody else dared to join in. I'm sure they were all quietly seething on the sidelines. It's a shame that JP didn't want to carry on having a discussion, but one also has to be aware of who else is in the audience. It may be that I got through in some way to some of the other people who were clearly fairly politically and philosophically aligned with JP and my acquaintance. It's a long, hard battle, but as I mentioned in the previous episode, all of us have got to take part in that battle where we can, within our own means, intellectually and physically. We have to play our part. And eventually, maybe we will gradually turn enough individual people, or at least have them say, you know what, I don't understand this conflict. I don't think I should believe everything that I'm reading in the press. I am beginning to question why they think X and Y and Z. I mean, what's also interesting is that JP and my acquaintance are all in the kind of political world where they're extremely skeptical about the government's response to COVID and pushing out the vaccine. So there, they were willing to not listen to government figureheads or what they were told in the mainstream media. But when it comes to Israel, it seems to just suit them to swallow it hook, line and sinker. That dichotomy is quite interesting to explore. And it's also a bit of a sensitive point to try and push on. Dave Smith is another one, but from the other side of the political spectrum. So I'm going to draw a line here for part one of From Tel Aviv Around the World. If nothing else, maybe there were a few useful arguments in there that you might use if you're challenged in some way, and some encouragement that it is worth doing so if you can spare the time. They can always spare the time. There are very low odds on my acquaintance having listened to this episode or the last one that I specifically invited him to and sent the link for. But mate, if you are listening, I'm always happy to have the discussion privately or to record one. I'm always happy to talk to your friends. I'm happy to do so in person. I won't run away from anything here. I'm happy to accept when Israel makes mistakes, which it does quite frequently, when I have disagreements with the government, which is pretty much all the time. In other parts of your life, I know that you are a big subscriber to the idea of open debate and discussion to try and find a different path forward. I would hope that you would apply the same metrics to this. And if for some reason you are not willing to do so, then, to quote your friends JP, it really is time that you and your supporters started a period of deep reflection and atonement. Thank you very much for listening.